Nice and ready. Hey, what's up, guys? I hope this is working. We're doing our live lesson on Wednesday for sci-fi and fantasy literature class. I'm going to post this assignment on Google Classroom, and then we'll look at it. So this is Wednesday, January 6th, Walk in the Sun, reading questions. That title should be the same title of this video, and also the same title in Power School when you look at the grade. It's not there yet, but it will be when I grade it. So it says due January 8th. That's Friday. That's not a huge deal. If you turn it in Monday, it's totally full credit. But I am going to put due dates on everything in order to make it look more organized on the student view. So if you're a student, it shows like, upcoming stuff and what's due this week. And if I didn't put a due date, it would just be in this kind of miscellaneous pile at the bottom. And that's what happened last semester. Some people were asking me like, oh, I never knew this thing was due because I didn't put it in on there. So anyway, this link for the video is the one you're watching now, or if you click it later, it'll just show the recorded version. Once we get a few, I'll put them in a playlist, and then people can look at the playlist of all the stuff if they join the class late or miss multiple days or anything like that. And most of them will be short. I'm not going to talk for the whole class and have a, movie-length video for anybody. Today we're going to look at this short story called A Walk in the Sun by Geoffrey Landis. Link's right here. And we got some questions that I'll ask afterwards. I'm looking at the chat. If anybody has any questions, you can ask them in the chat. I tried a bunch of Google Meets in the beginning of the year, but I found that nobody would turn their camera on, so it was just me and the chat. So it was the same as if it was a YouTube video, and the YouTube gives me a lot more options for how it looks visually and how to save it and how to put it in a playlist when it's over and things like that. So we'll still do Google Meets for other things. For example, office hours. Usually on Thursday and Friday, whenever we have impact, a B fifth period, that'll be office hours. And then I'll just have a Google Meet open and anybody can pop in and ask a question. And I got a lot of good stuff with that last semester with individual people saying, hey, can you look at my thing and edit it or whatever. Also this semester we have a lot of Fridays that are e-learning, that are just pure e-learning. So that's like a whole day of office hours. I'll just, post something in the morning and otherwise sit in a Google Meet ready for people to show up. Anyway, let's get to the story. I'm going to read a little bit out loud, not the whole thing. Then look at the questions I posted and give you time to work on those. So, Walk in the Sun from 1991. I usually put the year in the title because sometimes it's nice to know, especially when we're reading sci-fi. If it's sci-fi from the 1800s, that's different from sci-fi of the 50s or something like that. And once you see, you can probably get the idea of the style and be able to tell, even if I didn't put it. But I don't do a whole lot about the author's biography and that type of stuff. For this guy, I will mention a few things later. So anyway, Walk in the Sun. Let's read a little bit. The pilots have a saying, a good landing is any landing you can walk away from. Perhaps Sanjeev might have done better if he'd been alive. Trish had done the best she could. All things considered, it was a far better landing than she had any right to expect. Titanium struts, pencil slender, had never been designed to take the force of a landing. Paper-thin pressure walls had buckled and shattered, spreading wreckage out into the vacuum and across a square kilometer of lunar surface. An instant before impact, she remembered to blow the tanks. There was no explosion, but no landing could have been gentle enough to keep Moon Shadow together. In eerie silence, the fragile ship had crumpled and ripped apart like a discarded aluminum can. So we get crash landing. There's a craft of some kind. We don't know what yet, but it wasn't designed for this. And there's a couple people. We've heard Sanjeev, who's dead. We hear Trish, who's not. And we'll hear one more in a minute. And does it say they're on the moon? It doesn't say that yet, but the craft's name is Moon Shadow, so that's a hint. Let's keep going. The piloting module had torn open and broken loose from the main part of the ship. The fragments settled against a crater wall. When it stopped moving, Trish unbuckled the straps that held her in the pilot's seat and fell slowly to the ceiling. That's a nice sentence. Whenever you have sci-fi, you often will sneak in like unintuitive movements or physics or time or something like, fell to the ceiling is reminding us that the gravity is different or non-existent here, and it's not going to be the same as it is in our world. Fell to the ceiling is a nice little phrase. It's not, they don't like wink at the camera and they don't make a big deal of it, but it's just, hey, things work a little differently here. Or the craft's just upside down and maybe it is working normally, but the placement of things is not as it should be. So that's a nice sort of classic thing. There's some famous first sentences from sci-fi that have those like unintuitive little moments. Like in 1984, it says the clock struck 13. Or in Neuromancer, a famous 80s book, it says the sky was the color of a television tuned to a dead channel. And these things that are just like using slightly off-kilter or different physics, different comparisons to things than we would normally. If you were talking about a car crash, you might say fell to the ceiling if it was just a Jeep that had flipped upside down or something. But you might put more emphasis on it because that would have been more unusual in a terrestrial situation. I'm glancing at the chat. If anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat. If you're doing this for the first time, you might have to click through a few things to change your Google account into the kind of account who can do that, but it doesn't take much. She oriented herself to the unaccustomed gravity, found an undamaged EVA pack and plugged it into her suit, then crawled out into the sunlight through the jagged hole where the living module had been attached. So we're getting some clues here about what's going on. She was in the pilot's seat, so this person, Trish, is going to be the pilot or one of the pilots, This word EVA, EVA, I believe it stands for extravehicular activity. It's a NASA term for whenever they have to get outside the craft or get outside the station. When they do a moonwalk or something like that. And the author, Geoffrey Landis, is a real NASA guy. He's a NASA scientist who writes fiction sort of, on his own time. And in this story, we'll find a lot of stuff that is pretty legitimate, mechanics and stuff that is real terms, real physics and so on. It's not the kind of sci-fi that has, time travel and aliens and that kind of stuff is occasionally really based in as hard a science as it can be. But this is pretty plausible in a lot of ways. She stood on the gray lunar surface and stared. Her shadow reached out ahead of her, a pool of inky black in the shape of a fantastically stretched man. The landscape was rugged and utterly barren, painted in stark shades of gray and black. Magnificent desolation, she whispered. Behind her, the sun hovered just over the mountains, glinting off shards of titanium and steel scattered across the cratered plain. Patricia J. Mulligan looked out across the desolate moonscape and tried not to weep. So now we got the full name of our character. Trish was what we had before. Now we see Patricia J. Mulligan, which probably means this is going to be our main character, right? Usually, for the other characters, we're going to get like a one-word thing that we call them. But for our, character that we follow. We're going to get the full name and a full history and things like that. And then it's got a line break, which means this is sort of like a cut in a movie. It fades out for a second and you understand that time has passed and so on. Or if this was like a TV show, this would be the part called the teaser, and then you break for the credits, you know, and then you have like the beginning of the first act. First things first, she took the radio out from the shattered crew compartment and tried it. Nothing. There was no surprise. Earth was over the horizon, and there were no other ships in cislunar space. So we're going to get this radio as a big part of the story, which is that you have to connect to Earth, and you have to just actually have a line of sight. You know, the radio waves can travel through things, like they can travel through the wall of your car to get to your car radio, but maybe not through a whole planet or something. And if you have a straight shot to the Earth, if you can see the Earth, then that is probably going to be a better medium through which to send your radio. And they use a new word here. One of the things we're going to see in science fiction is a lot of words that might be either made up or they're just technical terms that you don't see a lot. Cislunar space. Obviously, we know lunar, it relates to the moon. Latin, luna, it's the name of the moon. And in this story, they are talking about the moon, our moon, Earth's moon, and not some other one. And then cis here, C-I-S, is a Latin term. It means like on this side, like on our side of a thing. So you might hear that word talking about gender. You know, you hear the term cisgender, which is the opposite of transgender. And one thing that happens a lot to words is that they'll start out describing a physical thing, like, oh, where is this thing, or where are these two objects related to each other, one's above or below or something like that. And then later they'll become used in a more conceptual way to talk about a social or physical or not physical, like a psychological phenomenon, once you get the main idea of the physical relationship. After a little searching, she found Sanjeev and Teresa. In the low gravity, they were absurdly easy to carry. Uh-oh, that means they're dead. There's no use in burying them. She sat them in a niche, or sometimes people pronounce that word niche, between two boulders, facing the sun, facing west, toward where the Earth was hidden behind a range of black mountains. She tried to think of the right words to say, and failed. Perhaps as well, she wouldn't know the proper service for Sanjeev anyway. Goodbye, Sanjeev. Goodbye, Teresa. I wish things would have been different. I'm sorry. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Go with God. She tried not to think of how soon she was likely to be joining them. Okay, so we see there were 3 people in this craft, because if there were more, we probably would have heard about it by now, which means this is a very small craft, and we heard that it wasn't really designed to land ever, so maybe it wasn't planned to get on the surface at all, and we'll learn about that later. And we have these other 2 characters are dead. Sanjeev, it says she wouldn't know the proper service for Sanjeev, meaning he probably had a religion that she's not familiar with. And then Teresa, sounds like a Western name, so this person was probably American or British. And they're both dead, and our main character, Trish, is just moving them a little bit, but doesn't have the time or the energy to do much more, and just has to say, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to move on here. She forced herself to think. What would her sister have done? Survive. Karen would survive. First, inventory your assets. She was alive, miraculously unhurt. Her vacuum suit was in serviceable condition. Life support was powered by the suit's solar arrays. She had air and water for as long as the sun continued to shine. Here's where it gets to the good stuff, okay? First of all, we see the Karen introduction. What would her sister have done? It's almost like as soon as the other characters are done, we're not going to hear anything from Sanjeev and Teresa. But we introduce a new one because it's very hard to have one character alone. Usually you need a conversation or a conflict of some kind. So we have Karen. And even though this person is not literally here, she's going to be a ghost in our mind, or a mentor from the past who our character thinks of. And that's going to be a big deal. And the other thing in this paragraph that's going to be a big deal that's introduced here is this. Okay, she had air and water for as long as the sun continued to shine. This is another thing that sci-fi loves to do, is to say something apparently metaphorical or apparently rhetorical, but it's actually real. So like, for as long as the sun shines, that sounds like a figure of speech, right? It just means forever, you know. You could say, oh, I love you as long as the sun shines. But in this case, no, it means literally this thing has power if it's in the light. And it doesn't have power if it's not in the light. So that's going to be the key premise of this story, is our character has to stay in the light in order to have power, in order to have oxygen and other life support elements. Scavenging the wreckage yielded plenty of unbroken food packs. She wasn't about to starve. Second, call for help. In this case, the nearest help was 250,000 miles over the horizon. She would need a high-gain antenna and a mountain peak with a view of Earth. Okay, so in this case, gain is a term that it means like you're focusing the direction. So normally an antenna can just broadcast in a circle. Like if you were looking from above, the signal would go out in a circle. But if you try to focus it in one direction, then you can kind of put all the power going this way, in which case we want to go toward Earth. We don't care about going the other way. So gain is, I don't know I'm not an electromagnetism expert, but it has to do with directing the signal in a specific way. I'm going to read a tiny bit more and then let you guys do the rest on your own. By the way, another cut here so we can kind of imagine that she's taken some time to get the inventory ready and, you know, start moving. This part feels kind of like a video game, like when you're getting the tutorial of your items and, you know, how to move and things like that. In its computer, Moonshadow would carry the best maps of the moon ever made. Gone. There had been other maps on the ship. They were scattered with the wreckage. It doesn't say, but I'm guessing the good ones were electronic, and then the ones she finds are paper. That's implied, although I don't think it specifies. She'd managed to find a detailed map of Mare Nubium, useless, and a small global map meant to be used as an index. It would have to do. As near as she could tell, the impact site was just over the eastern edge of Mare Smithii, Smith Sea. And this Mare, it means sea, like S-E-A, but obviously it's not really a sea. They don't have water on the moon. The deal is, I believe they were just named that when people thought it was liquid, when astronomers in the past would look at the moon and see circles that appeared to be lakes or seas. They named it that, and then later we realized, no, that's not the case. So we kept the name, because why not? It sounds cool, it's Latin, and it works. The mountains in the distance should mark the edge of the sea, and with luck, have a view of Earth. So, you know, I'm going to stop here. I don't want this video to be super long. 20 minutes is about good. So you guys can read the rest. And I know it appears to be long, but it's a simple story. You've got one person on this moon, has to stay in the light, so has to keep walking, which is not hard. It's low gravity. It's not like a high effort. But, you know, you have to stay awake, and you have to stay sane, and people can kind of lose their minds when they're alone and, you know, in a high tension scenario. So we get hallucinations of the sister, we get things blending into reality and not, and we get a little bit of some other characters of the people who are coming to help, but not a whole lot. So I got a couple questions for you guys, and I posted them on the assignment, and they're pretty simple. I didn't want to just say what happened, because, like, you know, if you read it, you'll get what happened. But what's one word or concept you didn't know, and what did you find when you looked it up? So, for example, when we were reading, I pointed out a few things about the names of the seas, or the names of a few technical terms like gain or cislunar or something. And when you read the rest, you might see another term that is a scientific term or a Latin word, or geological term of some way, and you might have to look it up and let me know what stood out, what you found, because that's a big part of sci-fi when you're reading about things that are not normal Earth, normal gravity, normal time, normal physics. You're going to have to describe them with new words. And that's part of the fun of sci-fi, is learning that stuff. And then what's one issue you thought of along the way? Maybe a continuity or logic issue, like, hey, why don't you try this? Or why does this work that way? Whenever the story describes gravity or light or radio, you might say, wait, is that really the case? Why doesn't she go the other way and quickly get back in the light instead of chasing it all the way? Or, why doesn't the radio go through the ground? Things like that. And this may address those later. Often you see an issue and you think of it, and then on the next page it mentions why. Or you could look it up, or maybe you just think of it. So give me some kind of issue, because one element of sci-fi or fantasy is the sort of thing nerds do when they read a story and go, but what about this? Or why did this character recognize this character? Things like that. I always get those recommended on YouTube. It's like, why did Moff Gideon know who Luke Skywalker was in Mandalorian, blah, blah, blah. People love to look at those sort of why questions, What's one thing the story does that a non-sci-fi story couldn't do? So, for example, we're on a moon, which is a very small thing, and you can walk all the way around it pretty quickly. I always imagine like Mario Galaxy walking around those tiny planets, and that's what I used for the thumbnail of this YouTube. Maybe you couldn't do that in a normal everyday story. But there are plenty of others too. What's one thing the story does that a non-sci-fi story could do? So, for example, this has a relationship between the main character and his sister, and thinking about the childhood and how one of them acted a certain way and another of them acted a certain way, and the younger sister felt certain feelings toward the older sister. And all of that is normal stuff. You can do that in any story. You could do that on a CW show, or you could do that in a novel. You could do that wherever. And so that you got to have a mix of both, and it's important to kind of pay attention to both elements. And finally, last question is, the author's a real NASA scientist. If you Google Geoffrey Landis, you'll see it lists scientist and aerospace engineer before it lists author. So that's his main thing. And he works at NASA, and he holds patents and all this stuff. So how does that make a difference? If he was a full-time author, he would have to do a lot more research rather than just knowing the stuff already. And how would that change the way he approached it? How would that change, the way it ended up? So those are the questions. You can copy those into a Google Doc, or you can do those in a comment. Not a class comment here, but a private comment, as long as you can keep it organized and keep it spaced and labeled and everything. So that's it. I'll end this video now. I don't want it to be super long. And usually I aim for about 15 minutes, but this one had all the stuff at the beginning, and it ended up a little over 20. That is your assignment. If you haven't done the previous one, this guy right here, check that out. You don't have to mark it done on Classroom. That doesn't matter. But this part, let me just look real quick. What's it going to be? 11. I got 11, which is about half the class, so I need some more. If you haven't done that, make sure you do that too. I'll also grade that on Friday. And it takes a lot less time, so you might as well. Thanks.